She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sara Gorski, and I am here today with another Broad Opinions episode for you listeners. If you have not heard a Broad Opinions episode yet, it's a new series I've started. Every couple weeks or so, I just come on and talk to you guys about current issues or sometimes just issues on my mind, like today's is going to be. But before I get started, if you're watching on YouTube, you might notice that I'm wearing my new Women in Science shirt. Let me stand up. Whoop. It's got 25 different women from science on it. And of those 25 women, I'm sorry to say that we have only covered 2 of them on this podcast so far, which is absolutely atrocious. Ada Lovelace is on there and Hedy Lamarr is on there. And the rest of them I have not done episodes on yet. So you can look forward to episodes about the rest of these lovely broads in the future. But back to today's Broad Opinion episode. You know, I actually had a different plan at the beginning of today. I always have all these different plans and ideas that I want to cover. And then sometimes all of my plans get thwarted when a piece of information comes across my desk that I just can't not pivot to. And today, that piece of news was that I'm trying not to get emotional. You can see me you can see me fight it. I'm going to be emotional this episode. If you hate emotions, don't listen to this episode. I saw a post on Facebook that my high school history teacher, Joan Davis, died. And, it's so funny. I didn't really keep in touch with many high school teachers after high school. I don't think many of us do. I mean, we were little shits in high school. I was a little shit in high school. I'm sure a lot of you were, and I'm sure a lot of my teachers thought I was a little shit in high school too. And I don't think they were necessarily wrong. And I had recently reconnected with Miss Davis. I still call her Miss Davis, Joan. I had recently reconnected with her, I think about a year ago, because I wanted to tell her about this podcast, because I thought she would be proud of it. I think, man, I'm really fighting it, guys. I'm sorry. The reason that this hits me so hard, obviously, isn't because I'm her best friend, because we didn't talk very much, but I feel like that class with Miss Davis she taught U.S. history, and I can't remember what year it was, actually. I'm totally blanking on what year of high school it was, but it was a really pivotal moment for me in my development and understanding of the world and how the world works and how it really works, and how the stories that we are told and the stories that appear in the news and are passed down from families and world leaders and governments, they're not always the whole picture. And they often omit quite a bit of real history and the other side of history. And in many ways, that is what this podcast strives to do, right? From the very beginning, when Chloe and Sam and I started Broads You Should Know, it was a desire to bring forward stories that we don't hear, because women have done amazing things throughout all of time and the entire world. We've covered women from, 60 BC. We have covered so many women that many people just have never even heard of. And yet, these women did amazing things and made amazing impacts in the world. And yet we haven't heard of them, right? And the point of this podcast is to bring those voices forward. And I feel like, in a way, Miss Davis's class was kind of the birth of this this is really important part of me and what I seek to do in my life and in this podcast. And so when I saw that Miss Davis died, I was very affected by it and very sad. Obviously, everybody dies, and I know this and you know this, and that's not shocking. But I think to feel the loss of someone who I think just made such a profound impact on me, and an impact that I seek to pass along and that I seek to embody in the things that I create. And Joan Davis was an incredible woman. And I guess I wanted to take a second with you listeners to acknowledge the incredible work that she did. I don't think she was an average history teacher. You know, I want to talk a little bit about her class. Our main text for the class, I think we maybe had a regular textbook too, but I still have the textbook that Joan taught from, which was Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, 1492 to the present. And I'm holding it up. If you're on YouTube, you can see this beautiful big blue book. You've probably seen it before. Maybe you've even read it, or maybe you haven't ever heard of it, and maybe this is going to blow your mind. But this book basically reviews massive historical movements in U.S. history, but from the other side of history. So not the winners of the fights and not the victors in the struggles, but the people themselves. That's why it's the people's history. And if you haven't read it before, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about it, because I do think it's worth reading if you've never read it at all. And if some of the things I say on this podcast ever are shocking to you, like, you know, one thing I've often said is Christopher Columbus was an asshole. And for a lot of people, that used to be very shocking. I feel like that's become a little bit more, you know, in the now. But Howard Zinn was one of the first people, I think, that really talked about that, and of the genocide that Christopher Columbus wreaked on the people where he first landed in the Americas. Because that is what he did. He didn't discover America. America was very populated, and he killed the people he found, and he aided in their killing and their enslavement. And I remember, like, early in Joan's class, why am I calling her Joan? It's Miss Davis. It's always Miss Davis. In Miss Davis's class, I remember reading this first chapter. The very first chapter opens with Columbus. And I remember being like, what? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He's a hero. And you read this chapter and you're like, what the fuck? Because that piece of knowledge about what Columbus did when he landed was not one that was widely publicized in Spain or everywhere else. You know, Ferdinand and Isabella, by the way, you know, I like to connect dots here on the podcast too. Ferdinand and Isabella, you know, were the royalty when Columbus crossed the ocean blue. And Ferdinand and Isabella were also the people who, in a desire to unify their power across Spain, also pushed out and massacred Muslim people who were living peacefully together with the Christians, as well as Jewish people. They were like terrible people. They basically kicked out all of the non-Christians from Spain. And that story, you know, have a look back at that story. I think that was Teresa of Avila, maybe, that episode we talked about that in. I might be misquoting which broad that was, but the history of Spain is a dark one and kind of scary too. And Columbus is a frickin' part of that, right? But anyway, back to people's history of the United States. I just remember, I think the chapter that always stands out to me most was the one about the railroad unions coming together and Eugene Debs. And how I never really, but until that point, didn't think much about unions and what unions did for the workers. And it's like, it's weirdly appropriate that Joan, like, passed like right before Labor Day, right? Because unions are such a people's story. Like when you think about what unions do, which is to protect people who can't individually fight against a corporation for their own livelihood and their own well-being. And the origin of unions is, it's dark. The reason unions were born is because people were dying and children were dying and getting their hands cut off in factories. And I could talk about unions and formation of unions all day. And we did talk a lot about anarchists, the anarchist movement, which is a huge part of the union movement, and the Haymarket riots. That was in the Lucy Parsons episode. So if you want to hear more about unions and the anarchist movement and what they were trying to do for the people, you should listen to the Lucy Parsons episode. But that story, Eugene Debs and the unions, I got introduced to the unions and to what they did and how they functioned and their purpose for the people in this book, in Miss Davis's class. It might have even been freshman year. It's like freshman or sophomore year. New high schooler. I don't know fucking shit. And there's Miss Davis bringing in the people's history of the United States. And it's a profound book. And I actually am going to read from it in a second, but I think that to teach outside of what the normal textbooks usually were, man, now I'm thinking it was AP history. Guys, I'm a mess. I didn't pre-script this, and my memory's always so bad looking back at my high school years. It might have been AP history. We read this one. I think I had her for 2 different years too, because she was just so good, and I wanted to come back to her class. But to teach outside of the normal parameters, the quote normal parameters of history, and to teach the other side of the story is so critical. And I don't know what kind of fights Joan, if she had to fight to teach that, or if she really got to make her own curriculum. I kind of don't know the origin story of that and her curriculum, but I have to think like it's not ever easy to teach outside the usual lines and the usual parameters. And I think I've always in my heart just felt like Miss Davis was a hero who refused to just kind of dole out the easy pathway. She wanted us to really learn some real shit about the world, and not just the US, but the world. And man, Miss Davis. Okay. I want to just read a little bit from this first chapter. If you'll indulge me, listeners, because I'm feeling indulgent in the memory of Miss Davis. So the book opens with the story of Christopher Columbus and the genocide that he committed against the Arawaks, were the tribes that he murdered. And I think this really well summarizes why history and learning all sides of history is really important. So indulge me, I'm going to read a little bit for you. To emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly to justify what was done. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, or condemn Columbus in absentia. It is too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise in morality. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, Hiroshima, Vietnam, to save Western civilization, Kronstadt and Hungary to save socialism, nuclear proliferation to save us all, that is still with us. One reason these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts, as radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth. We have learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that teachers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of the scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences. It is therefore more deadly. The treatment of heroes, Columbus, and their victims, the Arawaks, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress is only one aspect of a certain approach to history in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing as, quote, the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It is as if there really is a, quote, national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion, in the laws passed by Congress, the decisions of the courts, the development of capitalism, the culture of education, and the mass media. My viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different, that we must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interests, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by black soldiers on Luzon, the Gilded Age as seen by Southern farmers, the First World War as seen by socialists, the Second World War as seen by pacifists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, the post-war American Empire as seen by peons in Latin America, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can, quote, see history from the standpoint of others. My point is not to grieve for the victims and denounce the executioners. Those tears, that anger, cast into the past, deplete our moral energy for the present. And the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor is also a victim. In the short run, and so far human history has consisted only of short runs, the victims themselves, desperate and tainted with the culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims. Still, understanding the complexities, this book will be skeptical of governments and their attempts, through politics and culture, to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood, pretending to a common interest. I will try not to overlook the cruelties that victims inflict on one another as they are jammed together in the boxcars of the system. I don't want to romanticize them, but I do remember, in rough paraphrase, a statement I once read. Quote, "The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is." End quote. And that is an excerpt from Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. And that is a world exploded. That is the other side come to the front. in a way that high school Sarah had never ever heard before. And if you also haven't heard of the other side of some of these stories, I really, really encourage you to check out this book. And you obviously can pick and choose the stories that interest you, or you can read the whole thing. It's kind of a big book, but it's not hard. It's not a difficult read. It's difficult to read those things because a lot of them are really atrocious. And if you are a person with empathy, it is going to be hard to read, but it also is important. It's important to read. And the work that Miss Davis did in her high school classes to us little shits, the work that the magic wand that she waved when she made us read this, even when we whine and complain, it planted a seed for me. And I think probably for a lot of people that I had class with. And I cannot thank you enough, Joan Davis, for being such an incredible history teacher, that someone who never thought they would really be interested in history could be cracked open to see this whole new world and to ultimately bring us broads you should know, right? So thank you, Joan. Cheers to Joan Davis, and love to her and her family. And if any of my classmates out there, fellow York High School graduates, also remember Joan, you should write in with your memories, and you should share some of your memories of her class and of the impact her class had on you too, because I don't think that I was the only one. Thank you, Joan. You really were the broad that started it all. To learn more about Broads You Should Know, visit our website at broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, you can click on over to the About page and read more about me, my bio, photo, links to my stuff, all right there. Are you following Broads You Should Know on social? We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Broads You Should Know, and Twitter at BYSK Podcast. To suggest a broad, fill out the form on our website or email us at broadsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. If you are a fan of this podcast, please spread the word about us. Share an episode with your friends or family, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Likes, comments, subscribe, that all helps new listeners to find us. Broads You Should Know is produced by me, Sara Gorski, and edited by me too, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you enjoyed hearing a couple of these snippets of history scattered throughout this episode, then I highly recommend you check out a few of our previous episodes about those broads. We have Saint Teresa of Avila in Spain and Spanish history, and we have Lucy Parsons' anarchist history and the Haymarket riots. And then you should definitely check out our episode on Anacaona and the first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims. It's not quite the Christopher Columbus story, but it is pretty close. We'll see you next week for another Broad You Should Know.